It was standing in the river, both feet in the water, up to its knees. It was washing its face. I watched it do it twice, cupping the water in both hands and bringing it up to its face, and then it turned around and saw me. She was 38 years old, a botanist with 15 years of fieldwork across the Rocky Mountain West, a woman who had spent more time alone in wilderness terrain than most people spend outdoors in a lifetime. She was not prone to misidentification. She was not easily shaken. She was standing on the bank of the Conejos River in the southern San Juan Mountains of Colorado on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, 50 yards downstream from her campsite, when she saw something in the water that nothing in her training had prepared her for. What she saw that afternoon, and what the days surrounding it revealed, is the account that follows. She had been planning the trip for 2 years. Not a vacation, a working expedition, personal rather than institutional, the kind of project that accumulates in the back of a scientist's mind until it becomes impossible to keep putting off. She was building a photographic and written record of high-altitude plant communities in the southern San Juans, specifically the transition zones where subalpine meadow meets Krummholz meets the upper edge of the spruce fir belt. It was the kind of work that required time and solitude and access to terrain that most visitors never reached, and the upper Conejos drainage gave her all three. She was 38, with a doctoral degree in plant ecology, and a career that had taken her into remote terrain across Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. She was comfortable camping alone at altitude for extended periods. She carried the right equipment, knew the weather patterns, and had enough experience reading mountain terrain to make good decisions about when to push and when to sit still. She was not an adventurer in any self-conscious sense. She was a scientist doing fieldwork in country she knew well. She arrived at the Conejos trailhead on a Sunday in late July and hiked in 6 miles to a flat bench above the river where she had camped once before on a reconnaissance trip. The site was sheltered from the prevailing afternoon wind by a stand of old spruce, close enough to the river to hear it from the tent, but far enough back to be above any flood risk. She set up camp methodically, cached her food in the bare canister she hung from a spruce branch, and spent what remained of the afternoon light taking her first set of plant transect measurements in the meadow above camp. The first 2 days passed the way good fieldwork days do, fully occupied, physically demanding, mentally absorbing. She was up before first light to catch the low-angle morning sun for photography, working through her transect lines until early afternoon, then retreating to the tent during the worst of the thunderstorm window, then back out in the late afternoon when the light softened and the air cleared and the wet meadows steamed gently in the cooling temperatures. She saw elk twice, a pair of them moving through the upper meadow at dawn on the second day. She found a patch of alpine clover at an elevation several hundred feet higher than any previous record she was aware of and spent an entire morning documenting it. She was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she had come to do. The third day was a Tuesday. She was up at 5:30, made coffee on the small stove, reviewed her notes from the previous day while the light came up over the eastern ridge. By 7 she was in the meadow. By 11 the clouds were already building over the peaks to the west, earlier than usual, and she made the decision to come back down to camp and wait out the afternoon before pushing up to the highest transect line she had planned for later in the week. She was back at camp by noon, ate lunch, and spent an hour writing up her notes from the morning. By 1:30 the storm had moved through, quick and hard, the way the best San Juan storms are. 40 minutes of serious rain and one close lightning strike that sent her fully into the tent, and then clearing skies and that particular post-storm brightness that makes the mountains look freshly painted. She decided to walk down to the river. She had no specific purpose. The botanist's mind doesn't fully switch off. She would look at what was growing along the bank, maybe check the water level, maybe just sit for a while. She had been pushing hard for 3 days, and the afternoon was suddenly free and the river was 50 yards away and the sound of it had been a constant presence since she arrived. She walked down through the spruce trees on the unmaintained path that led from the camp bench to the water. She heard the river before she saw it, and then she came through the last of the trees onto the gravel bar and she saw it. It was standing in the water maybe 40 yards upstream from where she emerged. The river at that point was wide and shallow, running fast over a gravel bed with one deeper channel toward the far bank. The figure was standing in the shallower section, in water that reached just above its knees, and it had its back to her. She registered the size first, the sheer scale of it, the width across the back and shoulders, the height that placed the top of its head well above anything a human frame could account for. Dark brown, almost black in the direct afternoon light, covered in what she could see clearly from 40 yards, was hair, not fur, longer, coarser, moving slightly in the breeze that came up the canyon from the south. It was washing its face. She watched it cup water in both hands and lift them to its face, the movement deliberate and unhurried, the hands large enough that they were visible even from where she stood. It did it once, lowered its hands, then did it again. The gesture was so recognizable, so completely ordinary in its form, that she stood frozen on the gravel bar without breathing for what she later estimated was about 30 seconds, her brain cycling through and rejecting every alternative explanation her training offered her. It was not a bear. She had seen hundreds of bears in the field, and she had never needed more than a fraction of a second to identify one. This was bipedal in a way that was not incidental or momentary. It was simply standing upright, weight distributed across both feet in the river, the way a person stands when they are comfortable and have no reason to be otherwise. The proportions were not human. The scale was not human, but the posture, the behavior, the deliberateness of the movement, those were not the movements of any animal she had ever observed. It did not turn around. It stayed with its back to her, unhurried, doing what it had been doing, bringing water to its face, lowering its hands, pausing, doing it again. It had no idea she was there. The wind was moving up the canyon from the south, carrying her scent away from the river, and whatever sound she had made coming through the trees had been swallowed by the noise of the current over the gravel. She understood, standing at the edge of the tree line, that she was watching something that believed itself to be entirely alone. That understanding hit her harder than the sight itself had. This was not a display. This was not a moment where two creatures were assessing each other across a safe distance. This was private. She was seeing something that had no idea it was being seen. She took one slow step backward into the spruce trees, then another, keeping her weight on the balls of her feet, the way she had learned to move in field situations where sudden sound or movement would end an observation. She did not take her eyes off the figure in the river until the trees closed between them. Then she turned and walked back to camp, not running, though the impulse was there, not from fear exactly, but from something that felt like the end of a moment that had been given to her by accident and that she had no right to extend. She did not break camp. She considered it and decided against it. What she had seen had not threatened her. It had looked at her with what she could only describe as a kind of measured curiosity, the same quality of attention she recognized from years of observing animals in the field, the look of a creature assessing a situation and finding no cause for alarm. She had not been charged. She had not been followed. She had simply been seen, and she had seen in return, and both parties had stepped back. She went to sleep that night, listening to the river, and woke at 3 a.m. to a silence so complete that the absence of the wind she had fallen asleep to felt like a presence of its own. She lay still in the tent for a long time. Nothing approached. Nothing made a sound that didn't belong. By the time the birds started before dawn, she had decided she would finish her work. She spent 2 more days completing her transect surveys, moving methodically through her planned sampling sites, doing the work she had come to do. She did not go back to the river gravel bar that afternoon. She got her water from a smaller tributary that came off the slope above camp, where she had identified a clean spring on her first day, and she spent the rest of that Tuesday and all of Wednesday focused on her upper transect lines. On Thursday morning, she went back, not to look for it, or at least that is what she told herself. She went back to the gravel bar where she had stood the day before, in the early light before the day's fieldwork began, and she walked upstream along the bank to the wide, shallow section where it had been standing. The water was cold and moving fast over the gravel, and there was nothing in it. But on the flat mud shelf at the edge of the gravel bar, in the soft ground between the waterline and the first line of riverside willows, she found what it had left behind: fish remains. A pile of them, vertebrae and ribs and the plate-like bones of the skull, stripped completely clean, the flesh gone with a thoroughness that spoke of something that knew exactly what it was doing. Several fish at a rough count, though the bones were mixed together in a way that made an exact number difficult. The largest of the skeletal pieces suggested a fish of substantial size, bigger than anything the casual angler typically pulls from this section of the river. The bones had not been there the day before. She was certain of that. She had walked this bank on the way downstream to the spot where she had watched from the trees, and the mud shelf had been empty. She crouched down and looked at the pile for a long time. Around the edges of it, pressed into the soft mud between the bones and the willow roots, were partial impressions, not complete tracks, not the kind of thing she could measure and photograph and point to as definitive evidence, but outlines of something large, broad-footed, pressing deep, consistent with what had made the tracks she found the following morning on the upper edge of the same bar. She photographed everything she could and kept moving. What she had seen in the Conejos River that Tuesday afternoon was Bigfoot. She arrived at this conclusion not dramatically and not immediately, but the way a scientist arrives at any conclusion, by eliminating alternatives until only one remains. She knew what bears look like standing in water. She knew what elk look like. She knew what a human figure looks like at 40 yards, and she knew the difference in scale between a large man and what she had observed. Bigfoot was the identification that fit. Bigfoot was the only identification that fit. She said as much when she finally wrote about it, months after returning home, in a long account she shared with a small group of researchers who collect and study Bigfoot encounters from the southern Rockies. The southern San Juan Mountains have a Bigfoot record that goes back further than most people realize. The Ute people, whose territory encompassed this entire region for centuries before European settlement, describe a large bipedal being associated specifically with the high river drainages and the forested slopes above them. Not a spirit, not a metaphor, a creature, physical, present, to be treated with the same respect you would extend to any large animal that shares your territory and has been there longer than you have. The physical description in Ute oral tradition matches what encounter researchers document from this region with a consistency that is not coincidental. Tall, dark-haired, bipedal, more curious than aggressive and strongly associated with water. River crossings, fishing pools, the cold, fast drainages that come off the high peaks. People who have lived in the San Luis Valley and the surrounding mountain communities for generations carry accounts of Bigfoot that they don't typically share with visitors. A rancher whose family had grazed cattle in the foothills east of the forest for 4 generations described finding, repeatedly over the course of a single summer, the carcasses of rabbits and ground squirrels arranged in a line along the fence line of one of his upper pastures, not scattered by a predator. Set down. He did not know what to make of it. His grandfather had told him years before that there were things in the high country that it was better not to look for, and he had always taken that as the superstition of an older generation. He was less certain about that after the summer of the arranged carcasses. A woman who had guided fly fishing trips on the Conejos for 11 seasons described an afternoon when every client on the water simultaneously stopped casting and stared at the same point on the far bank. She had her back to whatever they were looking at and turned to find nothing. Whatever had been there was gone. But 3 of the 5 clients described, independently and without coordinating with each other, the same thing. A very large, very dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching the river. None of them used the word Bigfoot. One of them said matter-of-factly that it was the biggest thing he had ever seen standing on 2 legs. A ranger who spent 9 seasons working the South San Juan wilderness described finding, on 2 separate occasions in the same general section of the upper Conejos drainage, a set of tracks in riverside mud that he measured and photographed and filed a report on, and then, when no satisfactory explanation emerged from anyone who reviewed the report, quietly stopped mentioning 17 inches, 5 toes, a stride interval that required him to take 2 full steps to span. The depth in the mud was not proportional to the foot size. It was greater, significantly greater than the foot size alone would produce. He described this detail specifically because it was the one that stayed with him. You could argue about what made the tracks. You could not argue about the weight that made them. The botanist's photographs of the tracks from the riverbank, taken from above with a telephoto lens, are consistent with what the ranger described in his reports from the same section of river. She did not know about the ranger's reports when she took them. She had never spoken to the fishing guide who watched her clients stop casting and stare. She had no connection to the rancher and his fence line and his grandfather's advice. What they all describe, from different years and different vantage points along the same stretch of the Conejos drainage, is Bigfoot moving through the same terrain by the same river, doing what Bigfoot apparently does in this canyon, living there, using the water, occasionally allowing itself to be seen by people who were not looking for it and who, in the moment of seeing, did not doubt what they saw. She finished her fieldwork on schedule and hiked out on a Friday morning. She has not published anything about what she saw. It is not the kind of thing you put in a peer-reviewed paper on subalpine plant communities. But she has talked about it, carefully, with people she trusts, and the account she gives is the same every time, unchanged in its details, unchanged in its certainty. She saw what she saw. The river was cold and clear, and Bigfoot was standing in it, washing its face on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, 40 yards upstream from a woman who had spent her career learning to observe the natural world without flinching. She has not gone back to that section of the Conejos. Not from fear, she is careful to say that. From something more like respect. She went there to study plants. She found something that was not in her field guides and not in any framework she had been given for understanding what lives at altitude in the southern San Juans. She did her work and she left. Whatever she shared the canyon with that week did not need her to return and stare at it again, and she understood that well enough to take the hint. The tracks she photographed from the riverbank are still on her hard drive. The measurements in the ranger's field notes still sit in a file that nobody has formally followed up on. The fishing guide still works the Conejos in summer and does not talk about that afternoon unless someone asks directly. The rancher's upper pasture fence line has not produced any more arranged carcasses since that summer, which is either a resolution or the absence of one, depending on how you look at it. What the Conejos River Canyon holds, what it has apparently held for long enough that the Ute oral tradition found it worth naming and describing and passing down, does not resolve because someone writes about it or photographs tracks from a riverbank. Bigfoot in the southern San Juans is not a new phenomenon. It is not an internet-era creation. It is older than the National Forest designation, older than the fly fishing lodges downstream, older than the ranches in the valley below. The river drainage has been in use by Bigfoot for longer than anyone currently living can account for. And the Ute tradition suggests that the people who were here before them knew this and simply accepted it as a fact of the landscape. Standard explanations cover a great deal of what gets reported in wild country. Misidentification is real. Memory is unreliable. People see things at the edge of their visual field, and their brains fill in the gaps with what they expect to see. All of that is true, and none of it applies to a 38-year-old botanist with 15 years of field experience who watched something wash its face in a river for 30 seconds at 40 yards in clear afternoon light, and then watched it turn around and look at her. That is not a misidentification. That is not a gap-filling exercise. That is an observation made by someone qualified to make it of something she was not able to identify using any category available to her except one. The water in the Conejos still runs cold and clear. The upper canyon still draws the people it has always drawn. The anglers, the backpackers, the researchers, the hunters in the fall. The trails are maintained. The trailhead register fills up every summer with names and dates and planned routes. None of those people are looking for Bigfoot, and Bigfoot does not appear to be looking for them either. Most of them will not find it. but the canyon does not change its habits based on who is paying attention and who is not. And Bigfoot in this drainage has never shown any particular concern for whether it is believed in or not. If you have spent time in the southern San Juans, along the Conejos or the Chama or the Piedra, in the high drainages of the South San Juan wilderness or the lower canyon country to the south, and if you have seen something you did not have a name for or heard something from the river at night that the current alone could not account for, the comments are open. What gets shared there builds into something that no single account can build alone. The record grows one observation at a time, from people who were there and saw what they saw and are still, years later, certain of it. The canyon holds what it holds. The river runs through it regardless, and somewhere in the spruce and fir above the Conejos, something that washed its face in cold river water on a July afternoon continues to move through terrain it has never needed a permit to enter.